Executive Dialogue. Today we are joined with the Honorable Minister, former Minister of Finance, welcome. We are as well joined with Mr. Kanye, the former President of the Confederation of Zimbabwe Industry. We've got a very interesting discussion that we are going to be looking at, in particular on the currency regime and of course the currency reforms that we have been looking at as a country. In fact, it looks like we have had a long time in the woods in terms of trying to find the best currency regime for this country. Now I'll start with Honorable Bit. Honorable Bit, there are a number of changes that came with the recent monetary policy, in particular on the currency regime. The exchange rate has been liberalized to some extent, to 2.5 and 3.5 for others. What is your take? Is that the right route towards finding a sustainable currency regime for this country?
Thank you, Brains. Obviously, it's an absolute mess. It's an absolute dog's breakfast. The monetary policy announced on the 20th of February 2019, read together with the presidential decree made by Mr. Mnangagwa on the 22nd of February 2019, actualizing the monetary policy. It's an absolute mess. So you have the monetary policy that purports to do three things. The first one, and I say purports, the first one is that it purports to do away with the artificial pegging of the bond note to the US dollar, the parity of 1:1 that was brought in 2016. The second thing it purports to do is that it purports to float the exchange rate, and you have heard that word in the market, that the exchange rate has been floated. The third thing it purports to do is actually to create a new currency. That currency is called a very strange name, the Real Transfer Gross System Dollar, a very long name, which is reflective of the lack of thinking of those who are authoring this very strange.
But I thought the whole market was clamoring for the removal of the 1:1 peg.
Yeah, but that's why I said it purports, because that hasn't happened. So the 1:1 is still maintained. So if you go to your bank right now, you are still holding, whether it's in your case 100,000, 1 million US dollar, which is also 1 million bond note. So that is actually being maintained. And once you do that, it means that you keep on maintaining the pillar of arbitrage that allows elites to go to the Reserve Bank and access the US dollar at the artificial rate of US 1:1 with the bond, which you know that doesn't work.
Where would this money have come from, and who would have probably, because I'm looking at the exchange rate, the interbank rate at 2.5.
I'll tell you where the money is coming from. The money is coming from the export retention scheme, which they are still retaining. And one would have thought that once you liberalize the exchange rate, you should allow exporters to keep their money. Because one, it's unconstitutional for the Reserve Bank to take over people's export earnings, unaccountable to and oblivious of Parliament. Because in terms of the law, all revenues collected in this country goes to the Consolidated Revenue Fund, which is distributed by Parliament in terms of Section 305 of the Constitution of Zimbabwe. So, okay. So you can't, on one hand, pretend to have liberalized, and then you still appropriate, nationalize people's export earnings.
So are you implying that the government would be buying foreign currency at 2.5 and selling it at 1:1?
It's actually worse off. It's actually worse off. They are appropriating export retentions at 1:1. However, the excess, remember you've got 30 days now to you have now 30 days to liquidate the unretained amount. That is the one that they're going to buy at 2.5. So if you look at the monetary policy and if you look at the statutory instrument, they are both quiet on what is the expropriation rate for the amount expropriated through the export retention scheme. So it's a fraud.
Okay, I hear you. Let me give the opportunity to Mr. Dr. Kanyekanye. Okay. Welcome, Dr. Kanyekanye. You have heard his views with regards I think the whole market has been talking about liberalizing the exchange rate, and when the monetary policy statement was announced, the thinking was that, or even up to this day, in other quarters, that at least the government has been listening, and it has to some extent removed the artificial 1:1 peg. Your views on that, especially taking into consideration what it is explained by Honorable Bit.
All right, thank you very much. May I start by saying that my take of the monetary policy statement is slightly different. There are aspects from what he said that I agree with. But let me start by saying that as industry, and I in particular also as industry, personally participated in persuading the authorities to have an interbank market. I think this was arising from the fact that, as you are aware, up until then, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe was basically supplying foreign currency to what I call systemic industries, focusing on about 14 commodities. The greater part of industry was not getting any foreign currency, so they had resorted to alternative means. So I think this thing, by putting it across, it sort of avoids criminalizing what was necessary to keep some businesses that were not supported by the Reserve Bank to function. Having said that, it was true that we were strongly opposed to the pegging of the dollar, the so-called direct TGS bond note to the US dollar 1:1. I think that did not make sense.
So are you happy with the 2.5?
I'm coming to that, because the issue then was that what then is it what we call the interbank market? This is why I say some of what he says comes through. We envisage the interbank market as being a market where exporters, rather than the central bank, sell their excess foreign currency to anyone who would traditionally be a legitimate importer. In other words, it is supposed to be free-floating in the sense it's supposed to work on its own. Granted, as it started, we are led to understand that some 5 million seed money was put in the Reserve Bank, but it was never the intention that this is run by the Reserve Bank. What we wanted was to decriminalize what was necessary for industry to move on. What was also necessary was to ensure that this is done within a legal framework where banks and trusted parties can actually undertake those transactions. So that said, the issue of whether it's 2.5 or whatever it is, it's something else. But from a theoretical perspective, we envisaged, like what happened in 2008, I think we envisaged a situation where we, the same exporters, will sell currency to our colleagues on the same market, but at a viable rate. Because the whole essence of it is that we must have a fair return. That way, if you get a fair return, then perhaps it will spare exports. And I think if you look at it, it was done concurrently with the removal of the export incentives, which was being done through bond notes. So my take of it is that some of the elements that Honorable Committee says about what appears to be an attempt to control the interbank, it's clearly something that does not go well with some of us.
So what do you want done now to ensure that there is viability in terms of for the economy and of course for the exporters?
Well, the basic issue is that if it's an interbank market, it must follow free market. And if it's going to follow free markets, let it operate as free markets. But I think if you read in between lines, there's a subtle, if not so subtle, attempt to try and keep it somewhere. So in other words, it's like you are removing a peg of 1:1 to get to a peg of 2.5. I think if you start doing that, you know what people say about markets. You can do that, you can change rules, but ultimately it becomes
difficult. They've changed it for the tobacco farmers, for the gold, I think to about 3.5.
Yes, I'm a gold miner myself, it's 3.5. But I think the point that I'm talking about here, our understanding is that anyone requiring foreign currency, anyone requiring anything should not have a subsidized thing, because like you rightly say, the moment you have these distortions, you have these backdoor requirements, that's what promotes corruption and that causes all manner of things. And I think the idea was that anyone, be a manufacturer and everyone else, you should be able to go in that particular market.
But there is the other thinking from another quarter that, look, all this time the thinking policy thinking and the policy assurance has been that it's 1:1, and then you've got pensioners and savers on the other hand who are all of a sudden exposed to, you know, a loss of value. How do you now reconcile the two?
Well, the reality is it has happened. Every time you do a devaluation, call it a devaluation, however you want to put it across, I think the introduction of the currency and the peg, well, I'm talking of it as a peg, but it's really not a peg. It's something in between a peg and a floating thing. But the controlled peg, as it were, you definitely the loss of value, whether it's pensions, if you look at company values, if you look at stocks and whatever, I think everyone has been affected. The question that comes through is that what could have been done to mitigate it? Let me put it this way. In an ideal scenario, my own ideal scenario in terms of how we would have introduced currency is slightly different from this. We would have gone through the system which says what happens to the things that you're talking about. The RTGS balances, how do you deal with them? Do you do lane swaps so that you retain value? Because you see, we are coming from a background in the past where
so would you have wanted the value to be ring-fenced on the RTGS?
Certainly there's a bit of that. If you read between the lines, there's a bit of that that has come in the monetary policy. If you remember, debt incurred, foreign debt incurred prior to the MPS, there is an understanding that that must be registered and still be dealt with in a particular manner. But I think we should have had a holistic approach in terms of dealing with potential losses that would have arisen from everything else.
Honorable Biti, that's a very interesting aspect with regards to ring fencing the value of RTGS balances. We have $10.3 billion sitting in the banking sector today, and for some time thinking was it's 1:1. All of a sudden it's now 1:2.5 or 1:3, if not 1:4, whatever it's going to be. What's your view? Should that have been ring fenced, or should government have actually just freely floated the rate?
Yeah, look, I differ fundamentally with what John did on the 20th of February 2019. I don't believe that we needed to de-dollarize, which is what he's trying to do on the 20th of February 2019. And in fact, when you read the full monetary policy statement and not the three-pager that he circulated, there's some way in that monetary policy where he actually says if we dollarize, it will actually lead to an economic recession. That's strange economics. That's voodoo economics. There's nothing like that. What we actually needed to do, in my respectful submission, is that we actually needed to re-dollarize the economy, to strengthen the regime of multiple currencies. And as I keep on saying, that is only a stopgap measure.
But how would you have done that without introducing an exchange rate? Because here we've got a strange situation where you have 10 billion.
Yeah, let me finish the rates. First thing is you demonetize the bond note. You demonetize the bond note, you kill it completely. Second thing, you ring-fence balances, the debate you were having with Dr. Kanyikani. You ring-fence those balances, because this economy can't afford another shock. We had a shock of 2006 to 2008, where, according to the Justice Smith Commission and Insurance Pension Funds, 5.68 billion US dollars was wiped away from this economy just in pension funds. What about savings? So we can't have another shock of value in the system. So you needed to ring-fence that. Third, strengthen the regime of multiple currencies.
How would you? How would you ring fence? Because the ring fencing would imply, protecting value, right? Yeah. And protecting value would as well imply protecting it 1:1.
Yeah. Ironically,
how would you? Where would this? Remember, we are having a country that has rarely had a surplus on the current account, and you are trying to amortize, $10 billion, I don't know for how many years, to try and ring fence. How would you, where would that money come from? Who would give us the money to ring fence?
It's a very simple process. Ironically, the bank had actually started doing this. They printed money. They printed, there's a Zim dollars in their vaults right now. They actually started talking to the big players who are holding huge amounts of local currency, whatever you want to call it. And if you read the monetary policy statement itself, it discloses quite fully, quite clearly, that of the 11 billion US dollar, sorry, the bond note or whatever, that is in circulation, broad money supply, the bulk of it is held by less than 1,000 companies. That includes the INSCO group, that includes Delta, that includes EcoCash, that includes the major retailers, the OK Bazaars group, the Pick and Pay group, and so forth. In fact, one of them is holding as much as $3 billion. So that means the rest of us, ordinary people, it's hot money, it's quick money, it evaporates. So what they actually started doing was to negotiate with these holders of huge funds two principles. Two options. One is that we give you long-term paper. We give you long-term paper. The other issue was that yes, we compensate you, but at a discount, at a haircut. So that approach is possible. That approach is possible, but it's an approach which, if you are going to do it properly, you need help from organizations like the World Bank. You need help from organizations like the ILO.
But from
because
an ethical
of pension values. But so it's a process that has been done in other countries. It's not an impossible process. The process of ring-fencing values, particularly if you disintegrate the structure of the money in the system.
But if you're going to look at it from an ethical perspective and from an equity perspective, you're talking of pensions. These are people who would have contributed US dollars at one time. But look at people that probably contributed in October, November, just last year. They contributed surely bond notes, right? Money that is for all is no value. It's not as much value as is purported at 1:1. Would that then have been fair to the taxpayers in this country and to the exporters? Mr. Kanyikaji probably want to. Your money is the one that was then eventually going to be used to ring fence and demonetize and cushion whoever would have been on the verge of losing value. Would you have been happy with that?
I'll answer that in a roundabout manner. I think you need a short history of how money and currencies evolved. Originally, money, historically, if you go to the Mesopotamian era, it was basically a receipt for grain that was stored in a temple. It evolved through gold standards, the Chinese got paper money and so forth. But what constitutes money? You have the fiat currency, which is basically has no intrinsic value. There was at some point where you had a commodity type of currency which was linked to metals. So the issue that comes out is that Zimbabwe, like any other country, there's no gold standard, there's no silver standard. Everyone at this point in time works on the basis that money is largely underpinned by trust and confidence. So if you are going to have money, if you are going to do something with money, you must always understand you don't drill down on confidence and trust. So let's start off with what we are asking initially, and you see where the context comes in. You are saying if we are getting a bond note or whatever RTGS in a couple of weeks, it is not US dollar. That's not true. The average person at the point of getting, whether it was a wage or investment, was working on the basis that there was an official, trusted, confident position which they were confident about that it was equivalent to a dollar. So when we talk of ring-fencing, there are several ways, innovative ways. Honorable VT has talked about the need, for example, to use long-term paper. But there are other ways. If you characterize the deposits that were there, a majority of them were with corporates, which means there are so many other avenues that you can use. But let's just tackle maybe what people call the depositors with $250 million. We could, for example, have actually money takes different forms. We could, for example, have done even land swaps to the tune of about 258 million, just to preserve value. You and I know that if you have a stand in Borodale and build stand on an acre at a price of about 30-something US dollars per square meter, if you can get that, not cash, and the land is still in Zimbabwe, you would have to some extent mitigated potential losses that have arisen from that. But there are other innovative ideas that could have been done. And again, I want you to take you to the monetary policy itself. The fact that some corporates that were exposed by way of having had foreign debts were given an assurance that they would register those foreign debts, and then they will ensure that, notwithstanding what would have happened, those debts will continue to be honored by way of them supplying their only a one-to-one peg that was there. So there has been some consideration in terms of dealing with loss of value. But the question that comes through is that if you come from a position where you've not shown trust, and then you introduce a currency, then clearly you have a what do you call this? A prophecy of some sort, not the local type, but you have a prophecy which basically is saying that here I was, I said this, I have moved, I've broken the trust and confidence, I'm starting something else. You are actually creating problems for that money. So you needed to ensure that you come in that trust and confidence holding on, going on into the future.
So do you therefore think that remember at one time the professor came out saying he had secured about $1 billion from Africa of some kind to at least support the RTGS balances. Do you therefore think that we ought to have even considered borrowing offshore to support RTGS balances in this country and maintain the 1:1, which you sometimes call fiction? You use more fiction.
It's a Ponzi scheme.
Yes, a Ponzi scheme. So did you want us to support that Ponzi scheme with offshore borrowing? Maybe I could come to.
Yeah. So I think 2 points. The first one is that the figure of money that belongs to ordinary people, depending on who you are talking to, is fluctuates between $250 million and $400 million. Surely, for a country like this one, we can actually afford to compensate it 1-to-1. We can actually afford to give ordinary people $400 million to compensate. Gold last year was 33 kilograms, which they are mortgaging to the African Import-Export Bank. We have huge quantities of chrome. We have huge quantities of platinum. So if you look at our figures, export earnings last year, revenue collected almost $4 billion. So the problem in this country is not a money issue. It's not a money issue. We collect an average a month $500 million. In Africa, only Kenya, Nigeria collect those kinds of monies.
Are they US? Remember, you're talking about these. Remember, ours are they US dollars or they are RTGS?
Yeah, whatever. My point is that in this country, the issue is not about the revenue base. The issue is about how we spend that money. We've got an insatiable appetite for expenditure. We can't live within our means. And the second issue, which Dr. Kanye has touched upon, which is the epicenter of the issue, there is a trust deficit. There is a governance crisis. Nobody trusts them. So once you lose trust, the entire edifice of the international finance infrastructure, which is built on trust, disappears and completely collapses. The US dollar is the world's first reserve currency, but there's no money to back the over trillions of dollars that are in the system. But the system operates on trust. The biggest thing affecting our economy is that there's no trust. So coming back to the specific question of compensation, we can afford to give $400 million to ordinary people. So we then deal with three types of assets that we must compensate. We must compensate pensions. And pensions are a saving. So any country needs to safeguard and ring fence its pensions because they are primarily a saving. But they are also humanity. A person works until 80 years. In the case of President Mugabe, you work until 94 years. Surely we must pay you. I can see you've got a smile. But we must look after you. That's what decent societies do. So we cannot afford. I belong to the Anglican Church. It's full of widows. Some of these old people come to me and say, Tendai, I was a headmaster for 30 years and I'm earning a pension of $60. What I get per month is not enough for me to catch a bus from Tsambe Manikalen to come to Harare to collect my pension. That's indecent. It's immoral. Then we've got the huge corporates that owe over $6 billion, that are owed over $6 billion. Surely we must compensate them. But there is an immorality in what this government is doing. When I left government in 2013, there was $6.5 billion sitting in banks.
Were they US dollars?
Yes.
At that time,
yes.
Honorable BT, or they were already RTGS?
It wasn't RTGS.
Because
it wasn't. It was US 6.5 billion. Remember, if you look at the sources of income in this country, the sources of foreign currency. We have had since 2009 diaspora remittances of at least $1 billion US. That's coming into the economy. We have had overseas development assistance of at least $1.5 billion US coming into this country between 2009 and 2013. Albeit we did not channel it through the budget. So just one item, HIV/AIDS, $300 million US we're getting from the Americans alone. Then BIM, we were getting from donors over $300 million US of basic education assistance.
Where did this all go wrong?
It went wrong because of the budget deficit. It went wrong because there was a bank robber. And that bank robber was the government, which went to the Central Reserve Bank and started running an overdraft. Then RTGS emerged. Then the bond note emerged. The bond note, something that it was an export incentive, something that it was resolving the current issue. The bond note was actually created to monetize the huge gap that had been created. Otherwise, people were going to go to jail.
You are an exporter, Dr. Kanyikani. Yes. The bond note.
Before he comes here, these guys were exporting $3 billion US every year. $3 billion US every year. So as I said, the problem is
the government said let's incentivize them and they export more.
No. They took their money. They don't need incentives. If a person sells gold, he doesn't need an incentive because he's exporting something whose demand is inelastic anyway. So why give him a bond note let me just finish here. Why give him an incentive in bond note? Just allow him to keep his money. Just scrap the export surrender requirements. And that's what we did during the GNU.
Your views on the bond note?
I agree with what Honorability says. I think essentially, if you work on official statistics, even the Reserve Bank statistics, they actually show that in effect, we've actually been increasing the amount of exports that has come to the country. Like you rightly say, mining, tobacco, diaspora remittances and so forth. I think by and large, we are even close to over $5 billion, which is coming through. If you look at the identical economy, like Kenya, for example, Kenya does not make as much foreign currencies ourselves, but it doesn't have foreign currency shortages. There is something to do with the use and application of foreign currency that needs to be interrogated with a view to finding out what can be done. Some of them are fairly obvious things. For example, if you look at soya, we have been spending $300 billion importing soya seed which can grow here. I think it's just a reconfiguration of value chain. If you go to milk, you've got more or less the same scenario, where in the past we used to have our own IFAs and so forth, but we are importing most of the milk that is then mixed up in here. Packaging, we've destroyed the packaging industry. Quite most of what passes as basic commodities, cooking oil, Coca-Cola water, is the packaging that costs more, and we're importing that.
So are you confirming that the bond notes were of no help at all to remember at the time that these were introduced, I think you were still with CZI.
Yes, I'm still with CZI even now.
And you were very exuberant about it as an industry body, to say, look, we definitely need, I don't remember CZI on record, saying that they didn't need bond notes. So did they help? In any case, the governor just recently actually was talking about the successes of the bond notes and said they helped spur exports. What's your view on that? Yeah,
my view is that, yes, industry did ask for export incentives, which was basically also using a US dollar, and we needed some form of support so that we are competitive. I would suggest that with my head, I'm also chairman of Funding Investment Committee CZI. There are companies that actually benefited from the 5 to 20% export incentive scheme, which was emanating from the fact that you would export and then you get something to add up to that, which basically was intermixed with bond notes and RTGS money. So from that perspective, I think if you go into the clothing industry, you'll see some bit of that actually happened and increased exports. And I think if you look at the global picture in terms of official statistics, you actually have a situation where there was, in fact, an increase in export receipts for Zimbabwe during the time those incentives were done. But the issue that we are talking about here is that, was it the best way of doing that? Is that the way that we should have done? And I want to come back to the issue of a miner. Like I do mining, for example. Export receipts for mining works this way, prior to the scraping off of the 70%. For small-scale miners, you would get 70% of what you sell in US dollars. The other 30%, you would get it at an RTGS, you would get it at 1-to-1 in RTGS. And then over and above that, you then get another TGS 5% export incentive. I don't know if you do your maths very well. What you probably find out is that you are actually better off if you get your full foreign currency receipts as opposed to the permutations that we're doing. If you do the maths, you find that that's the way it should be happening. So I think, again, if you notice, when there was a shift again in terms of that surrender requirements, there was a reduction of gold production. So at the finer end, at the lower end, the normal person or Magweja in the gold industry, we call them, they also do the numbers, and they can tell that based on the numbers, if you give them foreign currency in particular, because also it's issue of currency, if you have US dollar and the other TGS dollar even now, I would ask you, if we're doing gold mining, you would probably want to hold more the US dollar than the other TGS dollar, because there's a lot of exchange volatility and so forth, and also price volatility. Whereas if you have a US dollar, you're able to do with your costs and so forth. So in a sense, what I'm simply putting across is, if we actually have an interbank market, and we have one in place, surely that becomes the objective model that everyone uses. You want to get rid of distortions. And in my view, I should be able to say I have my 100% of currency from gold mining or exports of commodity or products that I manufacture. It's important that the sort of interventions that come through, they may have unintended consequences. You've already seen that gold deliveries by the so-called informal sector has gone down quite drastically. And I think there were teams all over, including our mines, looking at what is going on. And we've told them the simple story. The simple story is that there is a lot of uncertainty and anxiety associated with the surrender requirements and the reduction in terms of US dollars that the miners are getting. And I think for exporters, for manufacturers as well, I do manufacturing as well. For manufacturing, what you find out that there was no surrender requirement. There is now a 20% surrender requirement.
Agreed. So, considering all you have said, Honorable Biti, you were the former finance minister, and you are aware the finance minister has oversight on the exchange rate issue. What would be your message to, or what would be your advice really to the Minister of Finance with regards managing the currency going forward?
Well, I go back to what he himself said just before he assumed office on the 1st of October, which was that the bond note was unsustainable and needs to be scrapped. So we need to re-dollarize this economy. That's the only solution, but it's a short-term measure. We need to eventually devalue that US dollar because it's overvalued. It makes our exports so expensive. And in my opinion, the only way is to join the Rand Monetary Union. But given the current mess at the present moment, they need to float the exchange rate freely. So remove the fixed exchange rate of 2.5. Remove export surrender requirements. Liberalize completely the interbank market so that exporters can sell to a market that will buy at a market-determined price. And I'm sure if they were to do that, the rate would actually come on its own from the $4 it is right now to possibly, in my respectful opinion, I think it will probably settle at around 320. Fourth, let's ring-fence the people's balances that have been devalued twice. They were devalued by the introduction of the bond note. They are now being devalued by the capitulation in accepting that 1:1 was never the same through the monetary policy of 20 February 2019. This economy needs confidence. This economy needs consistency. This economy needs boldness. This economy needs a government that watches the economy, not that puts roadblocks of arbitrage. But we are controlling fuel, we're controlling US dollar. We've commodified the US dollar. And if you commodify anything, it becomes a... So I know you don't want to hear this. There has to be a political solution because everything we are talking about is politics.
Why are you saying I don't want to hear that?
Since we embrace.
Can I come in on that as well?
Yeah.
My view is that, let's face it, we have a default position. The default default position is that in RTGS, dollar currency has been introduced. So my take of it is, what would the best scenario, in a best case scenario, where we can sustain that currency and makes it viable as it goes through, what is it that needs to be done? My view is that there are clear inflationary pressures that are coming off from the need to adjust wages. If you look at what has happened, is that prices since September last year have gone up by over 400%. Real wages have actually fallen down to maybe about 20% of what they were. So when you look at it, and then you look at government's finances in terms of the budget and so forth, there are two elephants on the way that have not been tackled, and I need to come to that. When you look at the Transitional Stabilization Program, it does talk about trying to deal with civil service reforms and cutting down the numbers and so forth. It talks about other things that need to be done, but we haven't really seen that. They've done some bit on the revenue side in terms of the 2% tax duties and so forth. But in reality, I see a situation that if we don't deal with inflationary pressure that will come from the government itself, we run the risk that this currency, the idea of having a stable currency, he mentioned 3.2 or thereabout. My view is that it will probably settle between 2.5 and 3. If that is the intention, which I seem to configure from what is coming through, we really need to tackle these issues. I would say what has happened so far, if you look at the review...
maybe if I could ask you further, how would you then tackle inflation? Remember, the government hasn't yet increased salaries, and they are already constrained from a budgetary perspective, and if they or give in to the demands, definitely that is going to create a lot of imbalances in the economy, and it will affect money supply growth and of course the exchange rate, etc.
I agree, but it's not a demand. When you have your salary being eroded to a quarter of what it is, when you put yourself back to it, that's not a demand, that's a self-correction. It's inevitable. Because let's face it, the facts that we have is that there is an appeal already for food assistance for half the population of Zimbabwe, about 7.5 million people, which the government is putting across. So quite almost 50% of the population will require food aid if you follow the bits that have been done. But I am saying to you, if someone has increased those price increases, if you don't do an adjustment one way or the other, they will not come to work because it doesn't make sense. What I'm simply putting across is that one way of mitigating that is not to keep the same numbers that what we have. Let me give you an idea so that you know where I'm coming from. Almost about 90% of the government's budget is going towards staff costs and whatever. 40% of that appears to be allowances, which you don't need a workshop to get rid of the allowance. You can take them off overnight. But what worries me now is that I've just been reviewing the Transitional Stabilization Program review for February, end of February this year. And it seems to suggest that we laid off about 3,300 or so youth officers earning $395. But at the same time, we've recruited about 1,100 educators plus another 3,000 something. So basically, we are tinkering. It's tokenism. The 5% is tokenism. What you really require is to do a drastic cut so that you can actually get to a situation where, if say you remain 50% of what you are calling your staff now, and you have to work with those, less the allowances, then perhaps it's manageable. But let me give you some certain figures. Government has 21 ministries. Of those 29 ministries, I'm led to understand that there are at least 98 permanent secretaries who are on a payroll as we speak right now. Against that background, even if you look at the civil service, both military, army, and so forth, you have a whole lot of people, ASCOMs, generals, and what have you. We can't afford that. This is a very small country, so we need to do something drastic to be able to do that, because whether you like it or not, in the next 3-4 months, civil service salaries have to be adjusted. Even if you adjust by 30% or adjust by whatever level, it's going to impact on the so-called primary surplus, which are rising largely because of revenue improvement.
So, Honorable, it's a very interesting discussion coming from Dr. Kanyikanyi with respect to the civil service numbers. You were the Minister of Finance. Did it ever come into your mind that something had to be done to the numbers? Yes. And did you, why didn't you do that during your time as the Minister of Finance to implement, those drastic measures? Is it easier to criticize from the outside? You can tell us from experience.
Yes, that what Joe is raising is very key. We have been discussing monetary policy. But it doesn't matter what you do on the monetary side. You must resolve the fundamental structural problems in the economy. So you can actually have a decent monetary policy. You can, for instance, actually de-dollarize, as some of us are suggesting, but without attending to these other structural problems in the economy, particularly on the supply side, you have a problem. So the issue of the wage bill is fundamental. 95% of total expenditure is devoted to one item, which is the wage bill. During my time, I used to pay 236,000 workers. 236,000 workers, and it was so simple to calculate because we used to pay them in 2009. We used to pay them $100. So my wage bill was around 26 million plus pensions 4 million, so $30 million per month. It was easy. When I left government and poor Chinamasa, they were now paying 550,000 people. 550,000 people, and a lot of it is politics. A lot of it is politics. You have a creature called the ward officer, the youth officer, who is employed by ZANU-PF through the state, who is working for the state. You need to get rid of that ghost worker. Just before the election of 2013, 89,000 policemen applied for the postal vote. You remember we had a special vote in terms of Section 81A of the Electoral Act, and the security forces actually voted 2 weeks before the actual election. They voted on the 14th of July 2013, when all of us voted on the 30th of July. So 89,000 police applied, 104,000 army officers applied, yet I'd been paying figures of 40,000 and 45,000 for the army and the police respectively. So there was a ballooning of the wage bill in double figures.
But you still have not really answered my question. During your time as the Minister of Finance, why didn't you institute this drastic civil service reform in terms of the numbers?
First, I want to tell you that the problem I had nothing compared to what it is right now. In my tenure, the wage bill was 75% of total expenditure, which is still high, and I'll tell you what we're trying to do. And around 12% of GDP. Now it's 95% of total expenditure and over 25% of GDP. What we did was, we occasioned an audit to be carried out by Ernst & Young from India, which was financed through the World Bank. And it found serious anomalies. But the GNU was a compromise. So the auditors were not allowed to audit the security forces, ostensibly on the ground that this was a security, this was a security issue. We had serious cabinet meetings in which we agreed to get rid of 30,000 people. There were resolutions to that effect. But when it came to implementation, the regime through President Mugabe said, we can't do this, let's wait until the next election. So we did try, and if you look at my budget statements, I kept on saying that.
So do you
this was
therefore
unsustainable.
think the current Minister of Finance has no political clout, so to say? So do you think you'll be able to implement these reforms that has been talking about?
There are two things that militate against the reform in this country. The first one is the political imperator, the power retention agenda. The second one is pure patronage. So if you take everything that we are talking about, foreign currency, for instance, we should simply de-dollarize, we should simply strengthen the regime of multiple currencies. But once we do that, it means the boys that are going to the Reserve Bank to get money, and we know who they are, they will collapse. They are the sharks that are controlling 4th Street. They are, in fact, they call them leopards, mbadas. They are the mbadas that they are controlling 4th Street. It will also mean that if we liberalize the fuel industry, the sharks that own Zula, that are in partnership with Glencoe in the pipeline, Trafigura, the Queen Bees of this world, the Secundas of this world, they'll also collapse. So economic imperatives are sacrificed on political imperator and on corruption. And that's the scourge of this country.
I will not go to the extent of mentioning names.
I've spoken on your behalf.
But what I would say is that, in principle, what he says is actually true. Any distortion basically benefits what I would call political elites. And I think, to some extent, I think there is some element into that. You just have to look at even the printing of money that was going on. You actually had quite a lot of treasury bills, which were actually being printed to finance command agriculture and so forth. But the point that I'm putting across to you is that we have this situation. We need to make sure Zimbabwe goes further on in a manner that makes sense. But in doing so, I would suggest that if I was the Minister of Finance for Zimbabwe now, here are the issues that are there. I do concur with this position that, look, sometimes political dialogue is necessary. Compromise is not a weakness. Where I come from business. Compromise shows confidence, the ability to maneuver under any environment. But we need to come together as Zimbabweans and focus on what this country requires, which is a turnaround of some sort. But in doing so, what I'm suggesting is that we need to move in a manner that says we now have this currency which we have. Where are we going, short term, medium term? And I do agree with him. I've published articles on the need to go for the rand. I don't make apologies for that. I do concur with him that because we have a trust deficit in terms of how we have managed our currencies, and to quote his words, in some areas he has talked of, we've bastardized a lot of the currencies that we've brought onto the market. So I think going on in the future, it's important that perhaps for now, we get associated with something that is trust and confidence. And the common monetary area that we're talking about through rand is, in my view, a viable option that we must look at. And I'm saying so in view of several things. There was an understanding that perhaps if you go to Europe, Davos and whatever, you come up with some denaries and so forth. I think the reality is that there's not much of that coming through. The most likely scenario is that with what has happened in the country, unfortunately with some unrest and people have interpreted it differently, we have a situation where the US is sort of given us an issue where they are saying, look, you guys, we are extending sanctions and so forth. But we still have Europe. Europe is a little bit cautious. It doesn't, in my view, I think it's saying if you can put your act together, there is still a chance you can go somewhere. And my appeal as a business person, not as a politician, is that we must align our politics and everything else to be able to leverage on such opportunities, to be able to make this country move in a particular direction that we all desire.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we are almost coming to the end of this program. So going forward now, what's your view with regards the sustainability of, or with regards the exchange rate? How do you see it going forward? Provided
the fiscal measures that are necessary to ensure that the currency it does not collapse do happen.
And do you think they can? They will happen?
You've been in business for a long time. I come from a school of thought that impossibility is found in the dictionary of force, but I'm not a prophet. I am saying the extent. These are the things that I would have requested if government has said put 10 things that you require to make it happen. Number one, we should be decisive and very clear about what we are doing in the economy and what direction we are following. There mustn't be any ambiguity. Sometimes too much democracy is a problem in the sense that we allow so many views even within government itself so that there's no clarity as to what we're actually doing. We need a clear pronouncement of the path that we are taking. It's espoused to a large extent in the TSP, but we also need the currency reform. If you remember, there was debate where others were saying it's not ideal to do it now. Now it has been coming through and so forth. So it's not so clear, and that makes planning very difficult. I would also suggest that going on in the future as well, the issues of corruption that Honorable BD talked about, I think they need to be dealt with. As long as we allow distortions that are hijacked by individuals for self-gain, I think that does not augur well for investment and so forth. We need foreign direct investment.
But there's been a lot of prosecution of high-profile cases since the new dispensation came into power. Do you think that has not been enough? More should be done? What is your view?
My view is that if you analyze value chains within industry, in any value chains within the country, there is certainly room to improve by removing distortions that are causing all sorts of problems that we're talking about.
No, I was talking about corruption in particular.
I'm also talking of corruption because corruption is when you have a value chain that allows you to use political influence to gain advantage over the other party, then you become the king of the village, as it were. So I think you need to remove that. And in any value chain, you can actually map it out and figure out what needs to be taken out so that business operates in a fair manner which lead to regulation as much as possible.
Thank you. Honorable BT, going forward, where do you see this thing going, the exchange rate? And probably three things that just need to be done?
Yeah, firstly, I think Brains will be wasting our time if we don't resolve the political question, the crisis of legitimacy in the country, the crisis of the deficit of confidence and trust. So dialogue and genuine dialogue is so key. It is so key that there's dialogue between the major protagonists, the MDC that I belong to, and Mr. Mnangagwa's party. On the technical issues, the currency is the least of our problem. We need to produce. We need to deal with the supply side of the economy. We need to grow the economy. This economy, given the demographics of the country where 69% of the population is below the age of 35, we have to grow this economy at the rate of at least 9% in real terms. So we need to remove all supply side constraints. We need the structural reform of the wage bill that we were talking about. We need to plug and decimate the infrastructure of corruption around the US dollar, around command agriculture, around fuel, and around commodities. You cannot have our minerals being sold for a song, concessions, special grants being given for a song to friends and funny people. Number 4, we need to attend to gross capital formation. Look at the state of our roads. With the great respect to the DRC, we're now the portable capital of Africa. Look at our energy. We are generating 500, 600 megawatts of energy. The currency is the last thing. And for me, demonetize the bond note, ring-fence people's balances, use the dollarize and use the regime of multiple currencies to allow you to achieve stability, then go on to the Rand Monetary Union. Then lastly, we have to live within our means. There has to be macro economic consolidation. There has to be fiscal consolidation. I used to say, we eat what we kill, and people thought it was a joke. And there's a bomb coming. I'm not a prophet. It is the wage pressure. Right now, they are boasting around some balancing because of income from the 2% transaction tax and the levies of fuel imposed on the 12th of January. But come the end of the year, we'll be in a deficit of $1 billion to $2 billion because the wage pressures, they are not going to resist them. You have had unions demanding a wage increase of $3,000 per month. So the shock is coming.
Okay. No, thank you very much for joining us on the Fingaz Executive Dialogue. I'm being joined by Honorable Tendai Biti, the former Finance Minister, and Dr. Joseph Kanyekanye, who is the former president of the CZ. I thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you, Comrade Joe.
Okay, done.
Were you streaming live? No.
It was live.